The most recognizable face in American history is carved onto mountains and printed on currency. A face of strength, of wisdom, of a nation unified. But that face also belonged to a man who often felt like a stranger to himself, a man who led a country through fire while quietly, persistently, battling the ghosts in his own mind. This is the story of Abraham Lincoln. But this is not a story of loud battles or of grand speeches shouted from a podium. This is not a story of loud shocks. Like all stories here, it will be told softly. A strange piece of history, whispered for a quiet night. The story of a life, told like a secret. So now, find a comfortable position. Dim the lights. Let your shoulders fall. Let your breathing slow. Let the noise of the day, the chatter of the world, simply fade away. We are leaving it all behind. Together, we'll travel back, to a different time, to a quiet place. We begin in a cabin built from logs and from silence. Imagine the cold, not the sharp, fleeting cold of a winter morning that vanishes with the first sip of coffee, but a deep and patient cold. A cold that has been waiting in the heart of the forest long before you were born and will remain long after you are gone. It is a living thing seeping through the mud and straw, chinking between the logs of the cabin, a constant, unwelcome guest. You feel it on the packed dirt floor, a chill that climbs from the soles of your feet into your very bones. It is the first thing that greets you in the morning and the last thing you feel as you drift into a shallow sleep. This home, if you could call it that, is just one room. A single, small rectangle of space, carved out of the vast, untamed wilderness of early 1800s Kentucky. This one room is the entire world. It is the kitchen, the bedroom, the living space. It is where life begins, where sickness is weathered, and where stories are whispered in the dark. There is no privacy here, only the constant, close presence of others. The furniture is not bought, but born from the forest itself. A rough, unsteady table, a few three-legged stools that rock on the uneven floor, and in the corner a pile of dry corn husks and bear skins that serves as a bed for the entire family. The true center of this world, its sun and its moon, is the hearth. The fire is more than just a tool. It is a member of the family. It is a guardian against the endless dark of the woods and the animals that move within it. You listen to its language. The soft hiss of damp wood, the sharp crackle of dry oak, the gentle sigh of embers collapsing into themselves. Its light is a painter, casting long dancing shadows on the rough timber walls, turning ordinary objects into strange fleeting creatures of the night. The family's life orbits this small flame, a tiny island of warmth and light in an ocean of cold and dark. In this cramped space, a family moves with a quiet, practiced rhythm. The father, Thomas, is a man of few words, a carpenter whose story is told in the calluses of his hands and the set of his jaw. The mother, Nancy Hanks, is a gentler presence, almost spectral. She moves with a weariness that seems older than her years, her face often clouded by a sadness no one speaks of. They are figures of mythic simplicity, etched by hardship. And in a corner of this room, a boy. He is tall for his age, with limbs that seem too long for his body, a collection of awkward angles. His name is Abraham. He is quiet, unusually so. While other children might fill the space with noise, he fills it with observation. He watches the way the firelight catches the dust motes dancing in a rare sunbeam that pierces the gloom. He studies the intricate map of lines on his father's hands. He sees the flicker of exhaustion in his mother's eyes that she tries so hard to hide. He is learning to read, not from books, for there are almost none, but from faces, from silences, from the vast, unspoken vocabulary of hardship. He is developing a deep, almost painful awareness of the world around him. Outside the single, ill-fitting door is a world of giants. Ancient trees, oak, hickory, walnut, form a dense canopy that blots out the sun, creating a perpetual twilight on the forest floor. This is a world of sounds, the cry of a panther in the distance, the rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth, the constant low hum of life and death playing out its eternal drama. To the boy, the cabin is not a prison, but a fragile shell, a tiny pocket of human existence in a world that is overwhelmingly wild and indifferent. There is not much here. No fine furniture, no shelves of books, no windows to gaze out upon the world. There is only the wood, the fire, the cold, and the silence. It seems like a world of absolute lack, a poverty of things. But in a place so empty of distractions, the mind has no choice but to turn inward. In a world with so little noise, you learn to listen, truly listen, to the few sounds that exist. The silence isn't a void, it is a canvas. It is a space where thoughts can stretch, where questions can form, where a deep and resilient inner life can begin to take root. The boy didn't know it yet, but this cabin, made of winter and silence, was his first and most important teacher. It was forging a mind that could find meaning in stillness and a heart that could feel the weight of a world precisely because it had known the weight of a simple, cold, and quiet room. A mind forged in silence develops a peculiar kind of hunger. It is not the hunger of the stomach, which can be soothed with bread and meat. This is a deeper starvation, a hollow space within that craves not physical substance, but the intangible, ideas, stories, and above all, words. For the boy, Abraham, the physical world around him was vast yet finite, a world of wood, soil, and sky. But he sensed that another universe existed, one far more expansive, contained entirely within the pages of a book. But books, in the untamed wilderness of the frontier, were a treasure rarer than sugar or salt. They were precious artifacts, carefully guarded, and passed from hand to hand with a reverence usually reserved for holy things. In the Lincoln cabin, there was only one, the family Bible. To the boy, this single volume was not just a religious text, it was a library. It was a world. He read it relentlessly. He did not just read it, he consumed it. He committed to memory the stories of its kings and prophets, its journeys across deserts. He learned by heart the Psalms with their soaring, poetic language. This one book, with its complex sentences and rich vocabulary, became the first gymnasium for his mind, training it, making it strong and agile. But a single book was not enough. The hunger only grew. He listened, he searched, willing to walk for miles for the simple privilege of touching a new book. One day, he heard a rumor that a farmer named Josiah Crawford, who lived several miles away, owned a book, a biography of George Washington. To the boy, Washington was more than a president. He was a figure of myth, a character who had stepped out of a story. To read of his life would be like learning a great secret. And so, he made the journey, walking through forests and across creeks, simply to ask to borrow the book. The feeling of holding it in his hands was something he would never forget. It had weight. It smelled of old paper, of worn leather, and of another world. That night, by the flickering firelight, he read. The rest of the cabin fell asleep, but Abraham was awake, his eyes scanning every line. Each turned page was a door opening, showing him cities he had never seen, battles he could not imagine, and ideas of honor, of a nation, of liberty. That one small book expanded his world from a single wooden room to the breadth of a continent. Then, disaster struck. He had tucked the book into a crevice in the log wall, and a sudden night rain soaked it through, warping its pages. His heart sank. He had damaged a treasure that was not his. The next morning, with an honesty forged by the very hardship of his life, he took the ruined book back to Mr. Crawford and confessed everything. He had no money to pay for it. Instead, he offered to work off his debt. For 3 days, from sunrise to sunset, he labored in the farmer's fields, pulling corn fodder under the hot sun. 3 days of hard physical labor in exchange for a book. At the end, Mr. Crawford declared the debt paid. The book now belonged to him. He had learned a lesson more valuable than anything inside its pages. Knowledge had a price, and he was willing to pay it. His hunger did not stop at reading. It pushed him to create. He wanted to wield the words himself, to arrange them to his own will. He practiced writing wherever he could. He used a piece of charcoal to write on the back of a wooden shovel, then shaved the surface clean with a knife to create a fresh slate. He wrote in the dust, in the snow, practicing his letters, his sentences. He was gathering his tools. Every new word was another stone. He did not yet know what he was building, but he knew he had to build. He was constructing a house inside his own mind, a house made of language, far stronger than any log cabin. It was a fortress he could retreat to, a shelter from the harshness and monotony of his life. But words, he would soon learn, for all their power, were a fragile shield against the sharp edges of true loss. A ghost will follow a person, but it cannot stop them from moving. After the great sadness of New Salem, Abraham Lincoln sought refuge not in stillness, but in ambition. He buried his grief under a mountain of law books and political pamphlets, moving to the new state capital of Springfield, Illinois. This was a different world. It was a place of paved streets, of brick houses, of formal parlors where deals were struck and futures were made. It was a town humming with the energy of men who believed they were building a great nation, and a society of women who understood the subtle power of social connections. For the man from the log cabin, this new environment was a wilderness of a different kind, one whose rules were unspoken and whose terrain was treacherous. In the social arena of Springfield, Lincoln was a giant out of place. You can see him there, in a crowded parlor, towering a full head above every other man in the room. His clothes, though bought with a lawyer's salary, always seemed to be at odds with his long, wiry frame, his trousers too short, his coat sleeves not quite reaching his wrists. While other men moved with a practiced ease, he moved with the slow, deliberate caution of someone afraid of breaking something. He would often sink into a chair in a corner, his face clouded by his familiar melancholy, content to observe rather than participate. He was a man of deep thoughts in a world that often valued shallow pleasantries, a storyteller of earthy frontier tales in parlors that preferred refined wit. It was an awkward performance, and he knew it. And into this world of awkward performances walked Mary Todd. She was not a quiet river like Anne Rutledge. She was a storm. From a wealthy, slave-owning Kentucky family, she was educated, fiercely intelligent, politically astute, and crackling with an ambition that matched, and perhaps even surpassed, his own. Where he was hesitant and self-doubting, she was confident and assertive. Where his manners were unpolished, hers were perfectly refined. They were in every conceivable way a study in contrasts. He was the raw, uncut stone of the frontier. She was the sharp, faceted diamond of high society. Their courtship was the talk of Springfield. It was an awkward dance, both literally and figuratively. At parties, he would stand stiffly by her side as she dazzled those around her. Their friends were utterly baffled by the pairing. Her sisters worried she was throwing herself away on a backwoods hick. His friends couldn't understand what he saw in a woman they sometimes found to be sharp-tongued and demanding. He called her his little woman, and she called him Mr. Lincoln, a formal address she would use for the rest of their lives. Their conversations were a strange mix of his folksy parables and her sharp political analysis. In today's terms, their friends might have said they simply had opposite vibes. The pairing seemed to defy a certain kind of social logic. It probably wouldn't have looked good on a dating app profile. Gloomy, self-taught lawyer seeks ambitious, high-strung socialite for, well, we're not sure yet. The attraction was not simple or easy to understand. It was a magnetic pull of two people who saw in the other something they themselves lacked. The dance was so awkward, in fact, that it faltered completely. At one point, Lincoln, overwhelmed by a wave of his deep-seated melancholy and crippling self-doubt, broke off their engagement. He was convinced that he was unworthy of her, that his own sadness was a curse that would inevitably poison her life as well. The ghost of his past sorrow had entered the room and convinced him that he was destined to bring unhappiness to anyone he loved. It was a moment of profound crisis, leaving them both wounded and the town whispering about the strange, failed romance. Yet, they found their way back to each other. Theirs was not a courtship born of simple, romantic passion, but something more complex and perhaps more durable. It was a partnership. They were two fiercely ambitious people who recognized on some fundamental level that they needed each other. He needed her social grace, her political connections, and her unshakable belief in his destiny. She needed his raw talent, his profound intellect, and his deep-seated integrity to achieve the greatness she craved for them both. They had finally completed their awkward dance, settling into a partnership that would change the nation. But in doing so, they were about to step into a new arena, that of domestic life, where the joys would be higher and the sorrows deeper than anything he had yet imagined. The awkward dance of courtship settled into the daily rhythm of marriage, and the Lincoln home on the corner of 8th and Jackson Streets in Springfield began to fill with a new kind of sound. It was a sound that Abraham, a man raised in the deep silence of the frontier, had rarely known, the chaotic, joyful noise of children. First came Robert, and then, 3 years later, a second son, Edward, known to the family as Eddie. This new role, that of a father, seemed to unlock a part of Lincoln that his political rivals and even his law partners rarely saw. The somber, melancholic man of the public sphere disappeared within the walls of his own home. He was, by the standards of the era, an astonishingly indulgent father. You can see him, a man of immense height and formal profession, down on the floor, wrestling with his young boys, his face lit with a rare, uncomplicated smile. He would let them run wild through his law office, pulling books from shelves and scattering important papers, much to the exasperation of his partner, William Herndon. He was their playmate, their storyteller, their climbing frame. This deep, almost boundless affection was perhaps a quiet rebellion against his own austere and emotionally barren childhood. In the laughter of his sons, he found a warmth that seemed to push back against the permanent chill of the sorrows he carried within him. For a time, the house was full. The ghost of the past seemed to have no place here, crowded out by the vibrant, demanding presence of new life. But life in the 19th century was a fragile thing, and joy was often a temporary guest. The shadow fell when little Eddie, a bright and cheerful boy, was not yet 4 years old. A sickness took hold of him, a protracted illness that today we would likely call tuberculosis. You can imagine the atmosphere in the house slowly changing. The boisterous laughter gives way to hushed whispers. The days become a long, tense vigil, marked by the sound of a child's labored breathing. There is a terrible helplessness in watching a small body fight a battle it cannot win. All of Lincoln's logic, all of Mary's fierce love, were powerless against the slow, inevitable tide of the disease. When Eddie died, the joyous noise that had filled the house vanished, and a new kind of silence took its place. It was not the contemplative silence of the log cabin, but a heavy, suffocating silence, thick with unspoken grief. This was a loss of a different magnitude. It was not a lover from a hopeful future, but a child from his own body, a part of himself. The most ordinary objects became monuments to his absence. A pair of small, worn shoes by the door, a toy left on the floor, and the most poignant symbol of all, an empty chair at the dinner table. This was not just a vacant space. It was an active presence, a constant, physical reminder of who was missing. The empty chair became a permanent fixture in the home and in their hearts. The shared tragedy did not unite Abraham and Mary in their grief. Instead, it isolated them. They were two people adrift in the same storm, but in separate, lonely boats. Mary's sorrow was an outward tempest. She would collapse into fits of inconsolable weeping, a raw, almost violent expression of her pain that frightened those around her. Lincoln's grief, true to his nature, was a quiet, inward collapse. The familiar melancholy returned, but this time it was deeper, heavier, pulling him down into a profound depression that rendered him silent and unreachable for days on end. They could not comfort each other, for they did not speak the same language of sorrow. Life, however, demanded that they continue. 2 more sons were born, Willie and Tad. They brought light and laughter back into the grieving house. Willie was a brilliant, gentle, and thoughtful boy, so much like his father. Tad was a whirlwind of joyful, impulsive energy, with a speech impediment that only endeared him more to his doting parents. For a time, a fragile happiness returned. The family found a new balance. The empty chair was still there, a quiet ghost in the corner of their lives, but it was now surrounded once more by the noise and warmth of growing boys. They had learned that the highest joys of family were inextricably bound to the deepest vulnerabilities. The love for a child was a bond that made life beautiful, but it was also a bond that could be broken, leaving behind a wound that would never truly heal. It was a lesson the Lincoln family had learned in the privacy of their Springfield home. It was a lesson the White House, with all its grandeur, would teach them again, in the most public and heartbreaking way imaginable. The path to the White House, when viewed from the great distance of history, can seem like a straight and inevitable line. But for the man living it, the path was anything but certain. In fact, for a long and quiet decade, it seemed to have disappeared completely. After serving a single unremarkable term in Congress, Abraham Lincoln returned to Springfield not as a conquering hero, but as a man whose national political career appeared to be over. He had opposed the Mexican-American War on principle, an unpopular stance that cost him support, and so he retreated from the grand stage of Washington, D.C., back to the familiar world of Illinois law. These were his wilderness years, a time of political exile where the man who would save the nation was, for all intents and purposes, forgotten. His life settled into a new, predictable rhythm, dictated by the seasons and the schedule of the 8th Judicial Circuit. You can see him, leaving his family for weeks, sometimes months at a time, to travel the circuit. He rides in a rickety buggy, or more often, on horseback, his tall frame folded awkwardly, a dusty black stovepipe hat on his head, and a worn carpet bag carrying a change of shirt and a few books. The world around him is a vast, empty expanse of prairie grass, stretching to a horizon that never seems to get any closer. You can feel the bone-rattling jolt of the uneven roads, taste the dust kicked up by the horse's hooves, and smell the sweet, earthy scent of the prairie after a rainstorm. He stays in rustic taverns and inns, often sharing a bed with another lawyer or a judge. the rooms filled with the sounds of snoring men and the smell of stale whiskey. In the small, stuffy courtrooms of county seats across Illinois, he was a familiar and beloved figure. He didn't look like a great man. He would enter the courtroom in his ill-fitting suit, drop his carpet bag on the floor, and often, if the proceedings were dull, would lie down on a bench or even the floor itself, propping his head on his hand to read a book while waiting for his case to be called. When it was his turn to speak to a jury of farmers and merchants, he did not use the complex language he had worked so hard to master. Instead, he spoke their language. He told stories. He used simple, homespun parables to make a point, his voice a high, reedy tenor, not the deep boom one might expect. He won cases not by overwhelming his opponents with legal theory, but by making the jury feel that he was one of them, a man of simple, common sense. But this period of seeming obscurity was not a wilderness for his mind. In fact, it was a time of immense quiet growth. Freed from the demands of constant political battle, he read more deeply than ever before. He worked his way through all 6 books of Euclid's Elements of Geometry, not because he had any interest in mathematics, but because he wanted to learn how to prove a point with irrefutable logic. He read Shakespeare to deepen his understanding of human ambition, tragedy, and frailty. He filled notebooks with his thoughts, honing his arguments, sharpening his intellect. He was becoming the man who could be president, even as the possibility of it drifted further and further away. You can sense his frustration in the letters he wrote during this time. He watched from the sidelines as new, more radical politicians rose to prominence. The great debates over slavery were intensifying, and he, a man of moderate, careful views, felt increasingly irrelevant. His name faded from the newspapers in the East. His political ambition, which had once burned so brightly, seemed to have been banked down to a low, smoky ember. He was a lawyer, a husband, a father, and it seemed, for a while, that this was all he would ever be. A good man, living a respectable life, in a corner of the country far from the centers of power. Yet this wilderness was a necessary part of his journey. It was a time of quiet tempering. Out on the prairie, away from the corrupting pressures of Washington, his own principles on the great questions of the day could solidify. It kept him connected to the ordinary people whose lives were a world away from the grand theories being debated in Congress. He was not just a politician thinking about the Union in the abstract. He was a man who knew, by name, the farmers, blacksmiths, and merchants who were the Union. The political wilderness was not a barren desert. It was a fallow field, a period of rest that gathered strength for the immense task to come. The quiet life of the prairie lawyer, however, was about to be shattered. For while he was arguing cases over stray pigs and disputed land claims, a storm was gathering. A distant rumble from the west that would shake the foundations of the Republic. A political fire had been lit in the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, and its smoke was drifting eastward, carrying with it a scent of conflict that would force the man in the wilderness to finally choose a side and to speak again, not just for a client, but for the very soul of the nation. The quiet life of the prairie lawyer was over. The fire that had been lit in Kansas and Nebraska was not a distant brush fire. It was a blaze that threatened to consume the entire nation, and its smoke had finally reached Springfield, pulling Abraham Lincoln from his political wilderness. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 was, for him, more than a piece of legislation. It was a profound moral betrayal. For decades, a fragile peace had been maintained by the Missouri Compromise, an imaginary line drawn across the continent, above which slavery was forbidden. This new act erased that line, allowing the possibility of slavery to spread like a contagion into new territories. It was a promise broken, a step backward into darkness, and it aroused in Lincoln a passion he had not felt in years. You can almost see the change in him. The quiet, melancholic lawyer, content to read his books in dusty courtrooms, was gone. In his place stood a man reawakened, his eyes holding a new fire. He threw himself back into the political fray, not with the cautious moderation of his past, but with the force of a man who has found a cause worthy of his entire being. He began to speak again, not just in courtrooms, but at fairs, at conventions, on the stump. And his voice was different now. The years of quiet study had forged his folksy wisdom into a weapon of formidable logic. His speeches became long, meticulously researched arguments, weaving together history, law, and a clear, unshakable moral clarity. He was no longer just a politician. He was a teacher, attempting to educate the public on the fundamental crisis they were facing. But the crisis was rapidly moving beyond the realm of debate. The political fire became a literal one. The territory of Kansas became a battleground. Pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers rushed in, each side determined to claim the future state for their cause. Violence erupted. Men were dragged from their cabins at night. Towns were sacked and burned. The prairie land became soaked in blood. The term "bleeding Kansas" filled the newspapers, a grim Gothic phrase for a grim Gothic reality. The abstract argument over a principle had become a small, brutal civil war, a terrifying preview of what could happen on a national scale. The mood of the country was darkening, the hope for peaceful compromise beginning to feel like a naive dream. Then came another blow, this one not from a rifle, but from a gavel. In 1857, the Supreme Court delivered its decision in the case of Dred Scott, an enslaved man who had sued for his freedom after being taken by his owner into a free territory. The court's ruling was a thunderclap. It declared that Scott was not a citizen and therefore had no right to sue. It went further, stating that African Americans, free or enslaved, could never be citizens and had, in the words of the Chief Justice, no rights which the white man was bound to respect. And it declared that the federal government had no power to prohibit slavery in any territory. To Lincoln and to many across the North, it was a legal and moral catastrophe. The highest court in the land had just enshrined slavery, making its expansion seem not only possible, but inevitable. It was in this atmosphere of rising tension and deepening despair that Lincoln accepted the Republican nomination to run for the United States Senate. And on a hot June evening in 1858, he stood before the convention in Springfield and delivered the most radical and consequential speech of his life. He leaned into the microphone of history and spoke words that would change everything. "A house divided against itself cannot stand," he said, his reedy voice cutting through the tense silence. "I believe this government cannot endure, permanently, half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall. But I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing, or all the other." At a time when every other politician was desperately searching for a middle ground, for a new compromise to stitch the nation back together, Lincoln declared that the middle ground no longer existed. He was saying the unsayable, that the country was on a collision course, and that a choice between two irreconcilable futures had to be made. He was accused of being a radical, an instigator, of inviting the very conflict everyone else was trying to avoid. But what he was really doing was holding up a mirror to the nation, forcing it to see the truth of its own fractured soul. He had lost the election for a seat in the Senate to his rival, Stephen Douglas. But he had won the argument for the soul of the Republican Party, and in doing so, he had set himself on a new, irreversible course. It was a course that would lead not to a senator's chair, but to the front door of the divided House itself, the presidency. The man who had lost the race for the Senate now found himself, less than 2 years later, the President-elect of the United States. It was a strange and improbable victory. The Democratic Party had fractured, splitting its votes among multiple candidates, allowing Lincoln, the candidate of the young Republican Party, to win with only a minority of the popular vote. He was a man who had not even appeared on the ballot in 10 of the southern states. And so, the greatest honor of his life arrived not with a feeling of triumph, but with a sense of numbing dread. It was a victory that, instead of uniting the country, was the very spark that would set it ablaze. It was a feeling like a sudden thé-boat chill in the middle of a summer's day, the moment you realize the warmth is gone and a long, cold season is about to begin. The reaction in the South was not one of disappointment, it was one of revolution. Before Lincoln could even pack his bags for Washington, the unraveling began. South Carolina, a state simmering with secessionist fever for decades, formally left the Union. It was a constitutional crisis of a magnitude never before seen. Soon other states followed, like dominoes falling in a slow, inexorable line. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas. You can imagine the news arriving by telegraph in Springfield, each message another blow, another piece of the great house he was about to inherit, simply breaking away and drifting into the dark. Federal mints were seized, arsenals were taken over, and a new flag, the Stars and Bars, was raised over government buildings. The nation was dissolving before he even had a chance to lead it. That long, tense winter between the election of 1860 and the inauguration of 1861 was a unique kind of torment. Lincoln was a president with no power. He could only watch from his small house in Springfield as the country he loved fell apart. He was inundated with letters. Some begged him to make a deal, to compromise on the issue of slavery, to sacrifice principle for the sake of peace. Others sent threats, crude drawings of gallows, promises of a violent death if he ever dared to set foot in Washington. The weight of a nation's fate was settling onto his shoulders, a crushing, invisible burden that he had to bear in the helpless silence of his study. Finally, the day came for him to leave his home. He stood on the rear platform of a train in the cold, pouring rain to say goodbye to the friends and neighbors he had known for a quarter of a century. This is the moment, the image, that anchors the story. You can see his face, no longer just melancholic, but etched with a sorrow so deep it seemed to have aged him years in a matter of weeks. The wind whips the rain against his cheeks as he speaks, his voice full of emotion. "My friends," he says, "no one, not in my situation, can appreciate my feeling of sadness at this parting." He speaks of leaving a town and a people he owes everything to. And then, the final haunting words. "I now leave, not knowing when, or whether ever, I may return, with a task before me greater than that which rested upon Washington." The train pulls away, leaving his neighbors standing in the rain, watching the man they knew disappear into the storm of history. The journey to the Capitol was not a triumphant procession. It was a flight through hostile territory. He was smuggled through Baltimore in the dead of night, wearing a disguise because of a credible assassination plot. The man chosen to be the leader of the nation had to sneak into his own capital city like a thief, for fear of being murdered before he could even take the oath of office. The inauguration itself felt less like a celebration and more like a military occupation. Sharpshooters were stationed on the rooftops surrounding the Capitol. Soldiers lined the streets. The air was thick with tension, an unspoken threat of violence hanging over the proceedings. You can see him there, standing on the portico, a tall, lonely figure against the backdrop of the unfinished Capitol dome. He places his hand on a Bible and takes the solemn oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. It was an oath to a union that, for all practical purposes, no longer existed. He was the president of half a country, the captain of a ship that was already breaking apart, its timbers groaning under the strain of an impossible storm. The prairie lawyer was gone. The quiet man from the wilderness was now the sole guardian of a nation in its darkest hour, and in a harbor in Charleston, South Carolina, a small, besieged Union fort named Sumter was running out of food, and the entire world was watching, waiting to see what the new captain would do. The silence of waiting was over. The time for decision was at hand. The first shots fired upon Fort Sumter were not just an attack on a federal garrison. They were a thunderclap that ended the long, agonizing silence of waiting. The time for decision was over, and the time of consequences had begun. In the North, the initial reaction was a surge of patriotic fury. There were calls for a swift, decisive action, a 90-day war to quickly crush the rebellion and restore the Union. Lincoln, now the commander-in-chief, called for 75,000 volunteers. But the quick, glorious victory that everyone expected did not come. The first major battle at Bull Run was a disastrous, humiliating defeat for the Union. It was a brutal awakening. This would not be a short war. It would be a long, grinding, and bloody struggle. From that moment on, the White House ceased to be just a home. It became the nerve center of a nation at war. As a silent observer, you can see Lincoln, his tall frame stooped with a weariness that went beyond lack of sleep. He spent long nights in the War Department's telegraph office, a small, quiet room that smelled of cigar smoke and anxiety, reading dispatches from the front lines. He read of troop movements, of casualty lists, of the maddening caution of his generals, who always seemed reluctant to fight. He pored over maps, trying to understand the brutal geometry of a war being fought by men who were not professional soldiers, but farmers, shopkeepers, and clerks. The ashes of the conflict began to settle on him, a fine gray powder of exhaustion and stress. The cost of the war was not measured in maps and telegrams, but in human lives, and that cost came directly to his desk. He was the final authority, the one who had to sign the execution orders for deserters and spies, an act that caused him immense anguish. And he read the letters from mothers and wives, begging for news, for pardons, for an end to the suffering. He was no longer just a president. He was the designated mourner for a nation that was tearing itself apart. Each casualty list was a fresh wound, each letter a reminder of the personal, intimate cost of his decisions. His own melancholy was no longer a private internal ghost. It was now fed daily by the grief of an entire country. And then, the ghost that haunted the nation found its way into his own house once more. In the winter of 1862, both Willie and Tad fell ill with what was likely typhoid fever, contracted from the contaminated water that supplied the White House. For weeks, Lincoln and Mary sat vigil, watching their boys fight the disease. Tad, the wild one, recovered. But Willie, the bright, gentle, thoughtful boy who was the light of his father's life, did not. He died in his bed, in the president's mansion, while the war raged on outside the gates. The nation was an abstract entity, but this loss was specific, tangible, and unbearable. The White House, the very symbol of his power and his burden, was now a haunted house, filled with the memory of his beloved child. The death of a second son shattered the fragile peace of the Lincoln family. Mary, already emotionally brittle, was consumed by a grief so profound she would never truly recover. She took to her bed for weeks, holding seances in the Red Room, desperately trying to contact the spirits of her dead sons. Lincoln, meanwhile, had to grieve while leading a war. You can imagine him, standing at his window, looking out over the grounds of the White House, his face a mask of stone, while inside he was crumbling. He now mourned for two sons, his own, and the hundreds of thousands of sons who were dying on the battlefields of his divided nation. The private and public grief had merged into one immense, crushing weight. It was out of this crucible of unimaginable suffering that Lincoln made his most transformative decision. For years, the war had been fought for a single purpose: to preserve the Union. But after so much death, so much loss, that was no longer enough. The war needed a higher purpose, a moral justification for the horrific cost. And so, he drafted the Emancipation Proclamation. This was more than a military strategy or a political maneuver. It was a psychological and moral turning point. It was an act of a man trying to find meaning in the ashes. By declaring that the war was now also a war to end slavery, he was attempting to cleanse the nation of its original sin, to ensure that the dead had not died in vain. He had sanctified the bloodshed with a righteous cause, but the end was not yet in sight. The war would grind on for 2 more long, bloody years. The question that remained in the difficult road ahead was what kind of nation would be left standing when the guns finally fell silent, and what would become of the man who had borne its sorrows. The war did, eventually, begin to end. After years of brutal, grinding attrition, of victories and defeats, the great armies of the Confederacy were worn down, exhausted, and starving. The Union, with its immense advantages in industry and manpower, was closing in. The feeling in Washington was one of weary, battered, but certain victory. And in the midst of this, in March of 1865, it was time for Abraham Lincoln to be inaugurated for his second term as president. The Capitol Dome, which had been a skeletal frame of iron for most of the war, was now complete, a symbol of the Union's endurance. On a raw, muddy day, Lincoln stood before a vast crowd to deliver his second inaugural address. The audience expected a speech of triumph, a boastful declaration of victory over the nation's enemies. What they received was something else entirely. It was one of the shortest inaugural addresses in history, less a political speech and more a somber, poetic sermon. He spoke of the strangeness of a war where both sides read the same Bible and prayed to the same God. He suggested that the war was a divine punishment, a terrible price being paid by North and South alike for the great sin of slavery. He claimed no righteousness for his own side, only a shared culpability in a national tragedy. And then, he concluded with a vision for the future, words that have since echoed through history as a perfect expression of grace. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. It was a blueprint for a peace without vengeance, a vision of radical empathy that is as rare today as it was then. A month later, that vision began to be put into practice. At a small courthouse in a Virginia village called Appomattox, General Robert E. Lee surrendered his army to General Ulysses S. Grant. The terms of surrender were generous, exactly as Lincoln had instructed. The Confederate soldiers were not to be taken as prisoners, but simply sent home, allowed to keep their horses to plow their fields. There were no victory parades, no humiliating rituals. It was a quiet, dignified end to a long and brutal conflict. When the news reached Washington, the city erupted in celebration. But Lincoln's primary emotion was not joy, but a profound and weary relief. The killing could finally stop. In the days that followed, those close to him noticed a change. The immense weight that had stooped his shoulders for 4 years seemed to lift. He was seen smiling, even laughing. On a carriage ride with Mary, he spoke of the future, of the life they might have after his presidency was over. He talked of traveling, of visiting California, of seeing the world. For the first time in a very long time, he allowed himself to imagine a life beyond the war, beyond the grief, beyond the White House. It was a brief, beautiful moment of hope, a final, gentle note in a life defined by sorrow. On the evening of April 14th, Good Friday, the Lincolns went to Ford's Theater to see a popular comedy. The city was in a celebratory mood, the war was over, and the president was trying to relax. You can imagine the scene, the gaslights, the crowd, the sound of laughter filling the theater, a nation breathing a collective sigh of relief, and into this moment of shared, peaceful joy, a single, sharp crack of a pistol. A sound that cut through the laughter and plunged the theater into chaos and darkness. He never regained consciousness. They carried his long frame across the street to a small, humble boarding house and laid him diagonally across a bed that was too short for him. A vigil was kept through the long, dark night as the life of the president slowly ebbed away. At 7:22 the next morning, he drew his final breath. The war was over. The Union had been saved. But the man who had saved it would not be there to heal it. His great and difficult vision of a peace with malice toward none would now be left in other, less certain hands. The room fell silent, and in that quiet, a new sorrow settled over the nation. His Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, looked upon his face and uttered the final, fitting epitaph. Now he belongs to the ages. You have journeyed from a cabin made of winter, through a house divided, and stood by the ghost in the White House. You have witnessed the story of a great and sorrowful life. Some stories are written in ink. The most important ones are written in scars. Sleep well, and may your own dreams be peaceful. If you're still awake, we'll be waiting for you in the next story.